Well, hello, it's Clinton with Life Training Institute. It's been a little while since I've recorded a video, but I'd like to get back into the habit of doing this on a regular basis. And so I'm thinking once a week or so I'll try and get a video recorded, as well as doing the podcast that Nathan and Aaron and I do. Try to do this once a week, try to keep up with it. And so if anyone watching this video has a question on their mind that they'd like my thoughts on, they can feel free to ask and I'll address it in one of these videos. Otherwise, I'll just get the questions I ask from questions asked in my presentations or in the Q&A portion, or submitted to me through emails and those kinds of things. Now, I apologize for my voice. I'm still recovering from a cold or from allergies or something, and so my voice isn't up to 100%, but it should be okay for the purpose of this video. Now, a little over a month ago, I went down to, or I guess not really down, I went over to the East Coast, over to South Carolina to stay with my friends Devin and Melissa Palou, and they set up some speaking engagements for me, including a talk in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, that was actually my first presentation I've ever given in North Carolina, which was pretty cool, but I got to speak to a Ratio Christi group there. And the topic of my talk was why pro-life people need to be amateur philosophers. And one of those reasons is because philosophers make distinctions, and a good number, if not most, of pro-choice arguments seem powerful on the surface because they fail to make some sort of really basic distinction. And so we talked a lot about those. And one of the distinctions I talked about that pro-choice arguments fail to make is the distinction between passive potential and active potential. The difference between those two are that something that has a passive potential has a potential to be or do something, but does not have that potential within itself. It must be acted upon from outside in order to actualize that potential. If we think of a block of wood, wood has the potential to catch fire, but it has that potential passively because it has to be set on fire from something outside itself in order for it to catch fire. Now, something that has an active potential has within itself the potential to become or do something. And so if we extend the analogy, we can think of a match. A match has the active potential to catch fire. It needs to be struck, but the match itself will catch on fire. And then you can touch the lit match to a block of wood in order to catch that wood on fire. Now, if we think of something like a calf, we can think that a calf has passive potentials and it has active potentials. A calf has the passive potential to become a hamburger. It would have to be killed and then ground up into hamburger meat, but it has that potential passively. But it also has the active potential to become a mature cow. And so the calf has that potential within itself, and if not prevented from doing so by being killed, it will develop itself into a full-blown mature cow. So if we think about human development, the sperm and the ovum cells have the passive potential to become humans. They have those potentials within themselves, but they have to be acted upon from the outside. They have to first fuse, and then they will become a human being. Whereas the embryo that results from the sperm and the egg fusion has the active potential to become an adult. It has the active potential to develop itself along the path of development into a more mature version of itself, that is, the adult. The noise in the background is actually my dog. I'm trying to get her to keep down, but she won't make too much noise. But anyway, so the embryo has the potential within itself to become an adult, so it has that potential actively. And all of the things that it will develop, its brain, its heart, its ability to be conscious and self-aware, those kinds of things are all active potential that the embryo has. If not prevented from doing so by an outside force, by killing it, it will develop those things on its own. So the question that was posed to me, how do I feel about contraception? Do I oppose contraception because contraception, or what contraceptives do, is prevent the sperm and the ovum from combining and fusing in the first place to create a human being? And so would I oppose contraception then? And my answer is a little bit complicated because I would say no, I don't oppose contraception on those grounds. I don't think that that because the sperm and the ovum have the passive potential to fuse and become a human, that we then have the moral or the moral obligation to allow them to do so. So I don't oppose contraception on those grounds. I do, however, think that that once the human being comes into existence, then since it has the active potential to become an adult, the embryo is the same kind of organism as the adult. And so if the adult has a right to life, so does the embryo. So don't let that distinction muddy the waters at all. And so getting back to contraception, then I would say, no, I don't oppose it on the grounds that we're preventing two things with the passive potential to become a human from fusing. I do, however, believe that contraception use is immoral, and my reason for believing that is because I'm actually convinced by Catholic moral philosophers on natural law, so while I would say I don't oppose contraception on those grounds that we're preventing the entities with the passive potential to become a human from fusing, I don't believe it's wrong on those grounds, but I do believe that it's wrong on natural law grounds. And so the question is then, what is natural law? Well, natural law is basically just asking what kinds of things are good for something. And so an analogy that Ed Fraser uses is we can think of a squirrel. Well, we can ask ourselves what kinds of things are good for a squirrel. Well, it's good for a squirrel to drink water, to eat food, to store up nuts for the winter, those kinds of things. If a squirrel does those things, it acts in such a way that allows it to flourish as a squirrel. But now consider a squirrel that instead of liking to store up nuts for the winter, this squirrel likes to lay out on busy freeways and eat nothing but toothpaste. Well, when a squirrel does that, it's not acting in such a way as to promote its flourishing. It's actually acting in such a way as to frustrate its flourishing, because the squirrel isn't going to survive long laying out on busy freeways and eating nothing but toothpaste. And so we would say that that squirrel is a bad instance of a squirrel, whereas a squirrel that drinks water, eats food, and stores up nuts for the winter is a good instance of a squirrel. Now, does a squirrel have a moral obligation to store up nuts for winter? Well, we would say no, it doesn't have that moral obligation, so the bad instance of a squirrel is not acting immorally. It's just acting in such a way as to frustrate its flourishing. Now, we would say that the squirrel doesn't have that moral obligation because the squirrel is not a moral agent. In order for something to be a moral agent, it requires intellect and will. You have to be able to recognize the moral law, and then you have to be able to act accordingly. So if you don't know that something is immoral when you do it, you're not morally culpable for it. And if you don't have the will in order to do something, if you're acting, say, under coercion or force, then you're not morally culpable for that action. So a bad instance of a squirrel is not acting immorally. It's just not acting in such a way as to promote its own flourishing as a squirrel. And so we can think of a tree also. Well, what kinds of things are good for a tree? Well, it's good for a tree to get plenty of sunlight, to be planted in soil, to get lots of nutrients, all of these kinds of things. Those kinds of things are good for a tree. It's bad for a tree to cut a tree down in order to build a house with it. But that's not necessarily an immoral act, because trees, again, are not moral agents, and so we're not acting in such a way that is acting immorally toward the tree. So the question then begins, what kinds of obligations do we have? Well, as human beings, we are moral agents. We have the intellect and we have the will because we are rational agents. Or if you want to get more spiritual or religious with it, we are created in God's image. But if you want to keep God out of the equation, if you want to just speak to a secular audience, then you would say that we're rational agents. We have a rational nature. And so what is moral or immoral for us has to do with the kinds of things that promote human flourishing or frustrate human flourishing. If I act in such a way that promotes my flourishing, then I'm acting in such a way that is moral for me to act. If I'm frustrating my own flourishing, then I'm acting in a way that's immoral for me to act. And so that also goes for each of our individual body parts. If I were to, for example, amputate my arm, I would say that would be immoral because I'm frustrating the natural use of the arm, which is to benefit the rest of my body by picking things up, by operating machinery, things like that. And so if we look at each of our individual body parts in such a way as that we can promote its flourishing or we can frustrate its flourishing, well, then we can say, well, how should I treat each of my individual body parts? And so we would ask ourselves, well, what's the function of this body part? For example, it's the function of my heart to pump blood. And we know that just basically by observation. We know that hearts pump blood, and so that's what its function is. And this goes back to Aristotle's four causes also, but I'm not really going to get into that because I'm just kind of trying to keep this just a bare bones minimum response, just to kind of give you my thoughts on it. And of course, I can go into detail at some other time. But yeah, for now, I'll just point you to other works by thinkers like Edward Feser, David Oderberg, and guys like that. In fact, if you want to read Edward Feser's The Last Superstition, that's a great book. I would highly recommend that, and that talks a little bit about this too. Or you can read his Scholastic Metaphysics for more of an in-depth discussion of these topics. But anyway, so the reason that I oppose contraceptive use is, again, not because it prevents the sperm and the egg from fusing, but because it frustrates the natural end of the reproductive organs. Now, we know that the purpose of those organs, the penis and the vagina, is for reproduction. That's why we call them reproductive organs, not recreational organs. Even though sex is enjoyable, the purpose of sex is not to enjoy yourself. The purpose of sex is to procreate, is to reproduce. Now, sex is enjoyable. So, in fact, you can answer that from the religious aspect of why God created sex, or the evolutionary aspect, which is simply that sex is enjoyable so that humans will reproduce. Because if evolution, or if God wants our species to be successful, then part of that is in reproducing, in making sure the human race continues. And so sex is enjoyable for that reason. So we would say that sex is enjoyable, but that's not the purpose of sex. The purpose of sex is to reproduce. And since sex is a reproductive act, and the purpose of the reproductive organs is to reproduce, if you're using contraception, then using contraception is not acting in a way that promotes the flourishing of the sex act or of your reproductive organs. You're actually working in such a way that frustrates the natural ends of the reproductive organs, and you're not working in such a way that promotes the sex act. Every sex act should be open to the possibility of reproducing children. So that's kind of my nutshell, bare bones defense of why I believe contraceptive use is immoral. Because again, I follow, even though I'm not Catholic myself, I am convinced by Catholic moral theory on this issue. So yeah, and again, of course there are objections and other things to be said about this particular issue. So I'll address those later. But that's just kind of my basic response. And so yeah, so if anybody is watching this video and wants to keep up and in fact, I'd love to continue the conversations too, feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Click the little bell icon, I think you need to do also, to make sure that you're notified of when a new video goes up. Because like I said, I'm going to try to do these once a week. I'm going to try to get them out by Saturday. So yeah, hopefully this helps to understand why some people don't oppose contraceptive use a little better. So yeah, again, I'm Clinton Wilcox, and thanks again for watching.